On a grey morning, when autumn leaves scattered across marble headstones like forgotten memories, Marcus returned to the cemetery as he had every Saturday for 3 years. He carried nothing, no flowers, no words, just the weight of absence that had become as familiar as his own breathing. His daughter's grave lay beneath an old oak, its stone weathered but inscribed with a name he could no longer say without breaking. He knelt in the damp grass, trembling hands pressed against the cold marble, and whispered things no one else would ever hear. That morning, a woman named Eleanor was leaving her own daughter's grave 2 rows away. She had come not out of devotion, but out of habit, the kind that outlives hope. As she turned to leave, she saw him, a man in his 50s, shoulders curved inward, lost in a grief so visible it seemed to darken the air around him. She recognized something in him because she carried the same weight. Eleanor paused. Most people looked away from such pain. They hurried past, uncomfortable with witnessing raw sorrow. But Elena didn't look away. What she did next, a small gesture, barely noticed, barely remembered, would set into motion a chain of events that neither of them could have imagined. It began with empathy. It ended with redemption neither had thought possible. This is the story of how one moment of kindness between 2 strangers revealed a truth both had forgotten, that healing comes not from time, but from being truly seen by another human being. Chapter 1. The Weight of Silence. Marcus had stopped expecting the pain to fade. 3 years had taught him that grief was not something you survived. It was something you learned to carry, like stones in your pockets that grew heavier with each breath. He arrived at the cemetery at dawn, before the world woke. The caretaker knew him by sight now and left him alone. Marcus appreciated this small mercy, the silence, the solitude, the permission to fall apart where no one could witness it. Emma. Her name was Emma. She had been 14 when the car struck her on a Tuesday evening in October. A drunk driver running a red light. The police officer's words had become a sound Marcus replayed endlessly, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. Emma had been walking home from her friend's house, homework in her backpack, life still ahead of her. Now she was marble and flowers that wilted within days. Marcus's wife, Claire, had stopped coming to the cemetery after the first 6 months. She had found other ways to mourn, therapy, a support group, eventually a new life that didn't include him. They had divorced 2 years ago. She said she couldn't bear looking at his face every day. It reminded her of what they'd lost. Marcus understood. He couldn't bear looking at his own face either. He worked as an accountant, a job that required precision and distance. He was good at it because he could focus on numbers instead of the fact that his daughter would never turn 15. He could lose himself in spreadsheets and tax returns, in the cold logic of addition and subtraction. Life had become subtraction only. The cemetery was the only place where he allowed himself to stop hiding. He knelt beside Emma's grave, his knees sinking into the wet grass. The October morning was crisp, the kind of day Emma had loved, bright but cool, full of possibility. She had wanted to be a veterinarian. She had kept a journal filled with sketches of animals, her handwriting careful and hopeful. All of it was locked in a box under his bed now, untouched and sacred. "Hi, sweetheart," he whispered, the words catching in his throat as they always did. I miss you so much." The wind moved through the oak branches above, and for a moment, Marcus let himself imagine that it was Emma's voice, that somewhere, somehow, she could hear him. He knew this was a delusion, but he clung to it because it was the only thing that made the silence bearable. He sat there for an hour, his body folded over the stone, his hands tracing the letters of her name. When he finally stood, his legs were stiff with cold, and his heart felt as if it had been wrung out and left to dry. As he turned to leave, he noticed a woman a few rows over, her figure small and still against the grey sky. She was standing before another grave, her shoulders slightly curved inward, and something in her posture told him she carried her own weight, her own grief, her own impossible loss. Most people at the cemetery pretended not to see each other's pain. They kept their eyes forward, their thoughts private, their suffering sealed inside. But Marcus saw her, really saw her, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than his own sorrow. He felt recognition. She turned, and for just a moment their eyes met across the rows of the dead. Then she looked away and began walking toward the gate. Marcus watched her go, and then he left as well, the two of them never having spoken a single word. Chapter 2. The second Saturday. Elena had been coming to the cemetery every Saturday for 4 years. Her daughter, Sophia, was buried beneath a birch tree near the eastern wall. Sophia had been 16 when leukemia took her. A slow, patient death that had stolen not just her daughter's life, but also Elena's sense of meaning. Elena worked as a nurse in a hospital, a job that had once felt sacred to her. She had chosen it because she wanted to heal, to care for others, to matter. But after watching her own daughter die, despite everything medicine could offer, that calling had curdled into something hollow. She still went to work. She still helped people, but she did it now with a deadness in her chest, going through motions that no longer connected to her heart. Her husband, David, had handled Sophia's death differently. He threw himself into his business, expanding their restaurant, working 70-hour weeks. He said it helped him move forward. Elena understood that he was running. She didn't blame him. Running was easier than staying with the pain, but it meant they grieved separately, in different rooms, until eventually they were sleeping in different rooms too. They were still married, but marriage had become a formality, a legal acknowledgement of a connection that had fractured beyond repair. On this Saturday, Elena came to the cemetery as she always did. She brought no flowers anymore. She had learned that flowers were for people who still had hope. Instead, she brought a small notebook. In it, she wrote letters to Sophia, things she wanted to say, things her daughter would never hear. It was a habit born of desperation, a way of maintaining a relationship with someone who existed only in memory. She sat beside Sophia's grave for 20 minutes, pen moving slowly across paper. She wrote about a patient she had helped that week, a child who had reminded her of Sophia. She wrote about missing her daughter's laugh, her terrible jokes, her way of rolling her eyes at Eleanor's concerns. She wrote, "I don't know how to be happy without you." When she finished, she placed the notebook in her bag and stood, brushing dirt from her knees. That's when she saw him. The man was 2 rows away, knelt before a stone, his posture so broken that Elena felt her breath catch. She had seen grief before, in hospitals, in waiting rooms, in the faces of people who had lost everything. But this grief was different. It was the kind that had hollowed him out completely, leaving nothing but a shell held together by memory and routine. He was older than her, maybe in his 50s, with grey hair and a face that had been worn smooth by sorrow. His hands trembled as they touched the gravestone. His mouth moved soundlessly, and Elena realized he was speaking to whoever lay beneath the earth. She should have looked away. Grief was private, sacred, not meant to be witnessed. But Elena found she couldn't turn away, because in him she saw herself. She saw the same kind of drowning, the same kind of slow disappearance. She watched him for longer than was comfortable, watching the way his shoulders shook slightly, watching the way his fingers traced the letters of a name she couldn't quite read from this distance. And something in her, something that had been calcified by years of loss, cracked open just slightly. When he finally stood and turned toward the gate, their eyes met for a brief, startling moment. Elena saw in him a recognition of her own pain, a mirror of her own emptiness. And then he looked away, and the moment passed. But it didn't disappear completely. It stayed with Elena as she left the cemetery, as she drove home, as she sat across from David at dinner while they ate in silence. It stayed with her because she had seen something in that man's face that she had thought was lost forever. She had seen another person drowning in the same dark water, and she wondered if somehow she might be able to throw him a rope. Chapter 3. The Silent Gift. The following Saturday, Elena arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual. Her heart was beating with a nervous energy she hadn't felt in years. She had spent the week thinking about the man, constructing scenarios in her mind about why he was there, what his loss might be, how deep the wound must cut to bring him to kneel before a grave every single week. She told herself she wasn't looking for him, but she was. She walked past Sophia's grave without stopping, and instead wandered through the older sections of the cemetery, past headstones worn smooth by decades of rain and wind. She found herself near the oak tree, where the grass was slightly more trampled than elsewhere, the sign of repeated presence, of ritual, of devotion. There were no flowers on the grave, just stone and the name Emma, and dates that revealed she had been 14 years old. Elena did the math without meaning to. 3 years. This man had been coming here for 3 years. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of that number. 3 years of Saturdays. 3 years of kneeling in the grass. 3 years of speaking to someone who could no longer answer. Elena had brought her notebook again, but instead of writing letters to Sophia, she found herself doing something else. She had always been artistic. Before Sophia's illness, she had loved to draw, filling sketchbooks with images of flowers, birds, landscapes. But she had abandoned that too, along with so many other things that used to bring her joy. Now, sitting on a bench a discreet distance away, she opened her notebook and began to draw. She drew Emma's grave as she imagined it might look in spring, surrounded by blooming flowers. She drew the oak tree above it, its branches full and protective. She drew light filtering through the leaves, creating patterns on the stone. And as she drew, something shifted in her chest, not happiness exactly, but a small movement toward life, toward creation, instead of mere survival. She spent an hour drawing, filling several pages with sketches. When she finished, she tore one page from the notebook, a drawing of the oak tree with early morning light streaming through its branches, and she left it tucked carefully beneath a small stone on the edge of Emma's grave. It was a small gesture, probably foolish, probably meaningless. But it was also the first thing Elena had done in 4 years that wasn't born from obligation or grief. It was born from something else, from the impulse to reach across the distance between two strangers and say, without words, "I see your pain. You are not alone." She left the cemetery without seeing the man, but as she drove away her heart felt slightly lighter, and her hands didn't tremble on the steering wheel. CTA, end of chapter 3. Comment where you're watching from. These stories of kindness connect hearts across the world. Chapter 4. The Discovery. Marcus arrived at the cemetery as he always did on Saturday morning when the world was still quiet. The grass was wet with dew and the air smelled of earth and something green. The eternal scent of living things growing where the dead lay sleeping. He went through his ritual as he always did, kneeling before Emma's grave, speaking softly to the stone, allowing himself the luxury of tears that he never permitted himself anywhere else. The cemetery was his only honest place. Here, he didn't have to pretend to be healing or moving forward, or any of the other lies people told themselves about grief. When he stood to leave, he noticed something on the edge of the grave, a piece of paper, weighted down by a small stone. His first instinct was to feel violated. People left flowers sometimes, strangers who perhaps knew Emma's story from the newspaper articles about the accident. But a drawing? A sketch? He picked up the paper carefully, as if it might disappear if he moved too roughly. It was a drawing of the oak tree above his daughter's grave, rendered in pencil with careful attention to light and shadow. The artist had captured the way morning light filtered through the branches, creating pools of illumination and darkness. It was beautiful in a way that made Marcus's chest ache. At the bottom of the sketch, in careful script, was written, "For Emma. May light find her always." Marcus stood there, the drawing trembling in his hands, and for several minutes he couldn't breathe. Someone, a stranger, had come to his daughter's grave and left this. Someone had taken time to create something beautiful in a place of death. Someone had acknowledged Emma's existence, had honored her with art and care. The tears came then, harder than they had in months. He didn't know who had left the drawing, he didn't know why, but the gesture seemed to crack open something in him that had been sealed shut. A small opening through which light could enter, through which the possibility of connection could seep in. He folded the drawing carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket near his heart. All the way home, he thought about the woman he had seen in the cemetery the week before, the one with the curved shoulders and the profound sadness in her eyes. Could it have been her? Had she left this? That evening, instead of placing the drawing in the box under his bed, where he kept Emma's journals and school photos, Marcus taped it to his bedroom wall. It was a small act, but it felt like the first time in 3 years that he had moved towards something instead of away from it. That night, he slept without nightmares. Chapter 5. The second gesture. Elena wasn't sure if Marcus had found the drawing. She returned to the cemetery the following Saturday, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. What if he had been offended? What if he saw her gesture as intrusive, inappropriate, a crossing of boundaries that should never be crossed between strangers? But when she passed Emma's grave on her way to Sophia's, she saw that the drawing was gone. Her first emotion was fear, fear that he had discarded it, rejected her offering. But then she saw something else. In the space where she had left the drawing, a new piece of paper had been placed, also weighted down by a small stone. It was a letter. Written in careful handwriting on lined paper, it read, "I don't know who you are, but I know what your drawing means. It means someone sees my daughter. It means someone honors her memory. Thank you. Whoever you are, thank you for reminding me that Emma mattered, that she still matters, that her life, though brief, left marks on this world that others can see. I don't know how to say this without sounding strange, but your kindness has changed something in me. It has opened a door I thought was sealed. I will be here next Saturday, same time. If you want to talk, I would like that very much." Elena read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears. She sat down heavily on the grass, the letter in her shaking hands, and allowed herself to cry in a way she hadn't permitted herself to cry in years, not from pain, but from the relief of being seen, of being understood, of knowing that her gesture had reached another person in their darkness. She spent that week writing and rewriting a response. What could she say? How could she explain her own presence in the cemetery, her own loss, her own broken heart? She wrote about Sophia. She wrote about becoming a nurse and then losing her ability to believe in healing. She wrote, "I thought I was alone in this darkness. Now I know I'm not." The following Saturday, she came to the cemetery for the first time, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She left her letter tucked beneath the same stone, along with another drawing. This one of 2 graves bathed in the same light, 2 stones connected by the beam of an invisible sun. This time, when she turned to leave, she saw Marcus standing a short distance away. He didn't approach her. He simply stood there, silently acknowledging her presence. Eleanor nodded, and he nodded in return. No words were spoken, but in that moment, something shifted between them. An understanding, a recognition, a silent agreement to continue this strange, beautiful conversation of art and letters. As Elena left the cemetery that day, She realized that she was walking faster, that her breathing came easier, that something inside her had begun to thaw after years of being frozen solid. Chapter 6. The conversation begins. The following Saturday, Marcus arrived early and waited. He brought a letter with him, pages written in his careful accountant's hand. In it, he wrote about Emma, about the girl she had been, her jokes and her dreams, the way she had loved animals and filled notebooks with sketches of birds and horses. He wrote, "For 4 years, I've been alone with these memories. Now someone has reminded me that they are worth sharing, worth honoring, worth being beautiful instead of just painful." When Elena arrived, he was still standing by Emma's grave. She paused when she saw him, and for a moment both of them were frozen in uncertainty. Then Marcus stepped forward slightly, and Elena did the same. "I'm Marcus," he said quietly. "Elena," she replied. They stood together before Emma's grave, two strangers bound by the shared language of grief and loss. "Thank you," Marcus said, "for the drawings, for the kindness." "Thank you," Elena said, "for the letters, for acknowledging the gesture." They talked for an hour, sitting on the grass beneath the oak tree. Marcus told Elena about Emma, about the girl who wanted to be a veterinarian, who had terrible jokes, who had been so full of life that losing her had felt like the sun disappearing from the sky. Elena told him about Sophia, about watching her daughter slowly disappear into sickness, about the helplessness of being a nurse who couldn't save the person she loved most. As they talked, something extraordinary happened. The weight they each carried began to feel slightly lighter, not because the grief disappeared, but because it was no longer being carried alone. When they stood to leave, Marcus said, "Will you come again next Saturday?" "Yes," Elena said simply. "I'll be here." No. As she drove away from the cemetery, Elena called David. When he answered, she said, "I think I need to talk to someone, a therapist. I think I've been drowning, and I didn't realize it until today." David was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I think I need that too. I've been running. Maybe it's time to stop running." CTA. End of Chapter 6. If this story has already touched your heart, hit the like button. It helps the message of compassion reach more people who need hope. Chapter 7. The healing begins. Over the next several months, Marcus and Elena became fixtures in the cemetery on Saturday mornings. They brought coffee in thermoses and sat beneath the oak tree, sharing memories of their lost daughters. Marcus talked about Emma's terrible sense of humor, the awful puns she loved that made him groan. Elena talked about Sophia's strength, the way she had faced her illness with a grace that made everyone around her feel small. But they also began to talk about other things. They talked about the lives they were rebuilding, the ways they were learning to live again. Marcus had started drawing, attempting to capture in sketches what Emma had loved about the world. Animals, trees, the quality of light at different times of day. Elena had returned to work with a different perspective, understanding that healing others was not about saving them from pain, but about witnessing their pain with compassion. One Saturday, about 3 months into their friendship, Marcus brought something to show Elena. It was a journal he had started, filled with sketches of Emma's grave at different seasons, different times of day, different weathers. Each drawing was accompanied by a memory written in his precise handwriting. "I'm trying to remember her alive," he said, "not just dead. I'm trying to capture what she loved about the world." Elena looked through the journal, tears streaming down her face. "These are beautiful, Marcus. These are so beautiful." "I couldn't have done this without you," he said simply. "I couldn't have found my way back to creating, to honoring her in a way that feels alive, without your kindness first reaching me in the darkness." Elena shared her own news. She and David had begun couples counseling, and for the first time in years, they were having real conversations. Not the polite exchanges of people who shared a house, but genuine attempts to reconnect. She was also considering going back to school to study art therapy, combining her nursing background with her rediscovered love of drawing and creation. Sophia would have loved that, Marcus said. So would Emma, Eleanor replied. The cemetery had become a place of resurrection rather than death. Every Saturday, Marcus and Eleanor would sit beneath the oak tree, and they would talk about their daughters not as lost causes, but as loves that had shaped them, that continued to shape them, that lived on in the ways they chose to live their lives moving forward. Chapter 8. The Discovery of Meaning. 1 year after Elena left her first drawing on Emma's grave, Marcus received a phone call at work. It was Elena, and her voice was trembling with excitement. "Marcus, I need to tell you something," she said. "I got accepted. Art therapy school starts in the fall. I'm going to be an art therapist for pediatric patients." Marcus felt tears spring to his eyes. "Elena, that's incredible. That's everything." "It's because of Sophia," Elena said softly, "and because of you, and because of finding you in the cemetery that day." That Saturday, they invited David and Claire to Emma's grave for the first time. Both had remarried or moved on in different ways, but they had also been transformed by Marcus and Eleanor's friendship, by witnessing how two broken people had found a way not just to survive their grief, but to transform it into something generative, something beautiful. Claire wept when she saw the journal of drawings Marcus had created, each one honoring Emma's life and legacy. David brought flowers and planted them around Sophia's grave, a gesture that marked acceptance of the death, of the memorial, of the need to honor what had been lost. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come here," Claire said to Marcus, kneeling before Emma's stone. "I'm sorry I ran away." "I understand," Marcus said. "I ran away too in my own way. It took meeting Elena to realize that running away from grief means running away from love." As they stood together in the cemetery, surrounded by the graves of the people they had loved and lost, something shifted. The cemetery was no longer a place of death and abandonment. It had become a place of reunion, of remembrance, of the continuity of love across the boundary between life and death. Elena thought about that first Saturday when she had seen Marcus kneeling before Emma's grave, his shoulders curved inward, his face broken with sorrow. She thought about the impulse that had made her leave a drawing, the small voice inside her that said, "This person needs to know they are not alone." And she realized that sometimes the most profound acts of healing begin with the simplest gestures of compassion, a drawing left on a grave, a letter tucked beneath a stone, the willingness to see another person's pain and reach across the distance to acknowledge it. Chapter 9. The Light That Remains. 3 years after that first Saturday when Elena saw Marcus grieving before his daughter's grave, they established the Emma and Sophia Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting grieving families and creating art therapy programs for children processing loss. Marcus had left his job as an accountant and now worked full-time, creating illustrated books about children who had died, their stories preserved in words and drawings that honored their lives and helped other grieving families feel less alone. Elena was in her second year of art therapy school, working part-time at a children's hospital where she led drawing and memory-sharing sessions for young patients facing serious illness or loss. The cemetery remained their sacred place. Every Saturday, without fail, they came, sometimes together, sometimes separately, sometimes with Claire or David or other people whose lives had been touched by loss. They tended the graves, left flowers that changed with the seasons, and sat beneath the oak tree in silence or conversation, honoring the daughters who had taught them the most important lessons of their lives. One Saturday, exactly 4 years after Elena left her first drawing, Marcus and Elena sat beneath the oak tree as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the cemetery. The light filtered through the branches of the oak tree in the exact pattern that Elena had captured in that first drawing, the drawing that had begun everything. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left that drawing?" Elena asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I think I would have continued to disappear," he said finally. "I think I would have continued to mistake grief for loyalty, continued to believe that the only way to honor Emma was to destroy myself. But you showed me that there's another way, that we can hold our grief and still be alive, that we can honor our daughters by living in a way that makes their lives matter." Elena reached over and took his hand. Their hands were marked by the years of loss, Marcus's with the tremor that came from years of holding himself together, Eleanor's with the calluses from drawing and working. But together, their hands were steady. "I'm grateful every single day," Elena said, "for your grief." Marcus looked at her, confused for a moment, and then understanding dawned. She was grateful for his grief, because it had led him to the cemetery, which had led him to Emma's grave, which was where she had left her drawing, which had changed both their lives. Gratitude for grief. It was a paradox, but it was also the deepest truth Marcus had ever understood. Because grief, when shared and witnessed and transformed into compassion, became the foundation for the deepest kind of love. As they sat together in the growing light, the cemetery around them came alive with the sounds of birds singing and wind moving through branches. And for the first time since Emma had died, Marcus allowed himself to feel something beyond pain. He felt peace, not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of meaning alongside it. The understanding that his daughter's brief life had led to this, to connection, to healing, to the discovery that light does survive within loss, that kindness can reach across the distance between strangers and change everything. The stone bearing Emma's name would remain in the cemetery. It would weather and grow smooth with time, and every Saturday, two people who had learned to transform their grief into grace would come and sit beneath the oak tree, honoring the girl whose death had led to the resurrection of two broken hearts. Epilogue. In the cemetery, beneath an old oak tree, two graves lie side by side, not in location but in memory, and every Saturday, the light that filters through those branches falls upon them with the same gentle mercy, as if the sun itself understands that love never truly dies. It only learns new languages in which to speak.